Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome, live from his home studio in Potsdam, New York, your favorite professor and mine, Dr. David Cook Kemper Curry.
Okay, so I suppose that requires a little bit of explanation. My eldest son, Galen, is a professional touring musician, so he has a little bit of extra time on his hands these days, basically quarantined in Virginia, and he also has a perverse sense of humor. So this is the way he's whiling away his hours. Not sure we will count on more of these, but I thought it was too precious to not share. So let's see here where we left off. More fun with Spinoza. So Proposition 14, there can be or be conceived no other substance but God. And Proposition 15, whatever is in God, and nothing can be conceived, be or be conceived without God. God is all there is. There is only one substance, right? With an infinite number of attributes. It gives us this picture of reality, comparing Descartes' system and Spinoza's system. So for Spinoza, there is God, right, who is viewed from different perspectives, different points of view, right, under different attributes, both the physical and the mental. So then the question becomes, is God in fact is Spinoza a God-intoxicated man, or is he a hideous atheist? So I want to unpack this a bit further and what all this seems to entail. And this will get us out of part 1 of the ethics and prepare us to move into part 2 of the ethics. So let's start with this question. What are we? In general, what are those things which we normally take to be substances? So Stephen Nadler, in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Spinoza, puts it this way. He says, what does it mean to say that God is substance and that everything else is in God? Is Spinoza saying that rocks and tables and chairs and birds and mountains, rivers and human beings are all properties of God, and hence can be predicated of God, just as one would say that the table is red? It seems very odd to think that objects and individuals, what we ordinarily think of as independent things, are in fact merely properties of a thing. When a person feels pain, does it follow that the pain is ultimately just a property of God, and thus that God feels pain? So if you think about this a bit, all sorts of very weird consequences would follow from taking it that modes are properties of God. And Spinoza is certainly aware of this. And so he suggests, as we move on, a different way to think about this. So in fact, in the very next proposition, Proposition 16, he says, from the necessity of the divine nature, there must follow infinite things in infinite ways. That is, everything that can come within the scope of infinite intellect. So how does this help? Well, here, and as Spinoza moves forward, God is conceived not so much as containing all things, or as being the underlying substance of all things, but as the cause of all things. To be a mode, then, is to be an effect of God, who is the cause. Proposition 17 explains a little bit further how God is the cause, or the way in which God causes. So it claims that God acts solely from the laws of his own nature, constrained by none. And here it's helpful to recall definition 7. That thing, he says, is said to be free, which exists solely from the necessity of its own nature and is determined to action by itself alone. That's God. He exists solely by the necessity of his own nature, right? His essence entails existence. And there is nothing outside of him which could determine him to act, right? So everything that causes him to act is self-determined. A thing is said to be necessary or constrained, he says, if it's determined by another thing to exist and to act in a definite and determinate way. So all of the modes, right, are necessary. So when he says God acts solely from the laws of his own nature, constrained by none, Really, what he's saying is that God is a free cause. Indeed, he's the only free cause. But we have to be careful here with free, because free here is likely to be misunderstood. How God acts is determined by his nature. Spinoza's universe is a causally determined one. Indeed, it's a mathematically necessary one. As Nadler says, everything is absolutely and necessarily determined. In fact, Spinoza thinks that effects follow from their causes in the same sort of way as conclusions follow from the premises in a deductively valid argument of necessity. Okay? So when I say mathematically determined or causally determined, we could also express that by saying Spinoza's universe is logically determined. So it follows, right, skipping ahead a little bit to Proposition 29, that nothing in nature is contingent. All things are from the necessity of the divine nature, determined to exist and to act in a definite way. I'm going to ask you later to think a little bit about this. What do we mean when we say, then, that something is contingent? We speak that way about the universe. What is it that we're saying? What is it that we're expressing when we express the idea of contingency? Proposition 33. Things could not have been produced by God in any other way or in any other order than is the case, right? So the universe flows from out of God's very nature with necessity, and again, logical necessity. We can then imagine two ways in which things depend upon God, or in which God causes things. Directly, right? He causes the general physical laws of the universe. These are what he calls infinite modes. Yeah. The physical laws of the universe, which govern the attribute of extension, and the laws of logic or psychology, which govern the attribute of thought, right? And then indirectly, the finite modes, particular and individual things. They, of course, come to be from out of the general physical laws and the general laws of logic and psychology, right? So these are direct and give rise to these, the finite modes. Now, you may have already seen this, but at one point in the Ethics, Spinoza actually makes it explicit, at least in the Latin edition, not in the Dutch. And it may have been excised from the Dutch edition on purpose, because, as you should be able to see, this is a pretty radical thought. So in the preface to Part 4 of the Latin edition of the Ethics, he says, that eternal and infinite being we call God, or nature, acts from the same necessity from which he exists. Sorry, that's not in our text. This phrase, God or nature, raises again the question, is he a hideous atheist or is he a God-intoxicated man? Spinoza himself is inviting us to use those phrases interchangeably. It is God or, if you prefer, nature, one and the same thing. In the Scholium to Proposition 29, Spinoza gives us two perspectives on God's nature. So he says, before I go any further, I wish to explain at this point what we must understand as by natura naturans and natura naturata. I should perhaps say, not explain, but remind the reader, for I consider that it is already clear from what has gone before, that by natura naturans we must understand that which is in itself and is conceived through itself, that is, the attributes of substance that express eternal and infinite essence, or God insofar as he is considered a free cause. By natura naturata, I understand all that follows from the necessity of God's nature, that is, from the necessity of each one of God's attributes, or all the modes of God's attributes, insofar as they are considered as things which are in God and can neither be nor be conceived without God. So there are these two ways of thinking about the universe. I can think about it as God, insofar as he is considered a free cause, the cause of everything, the source of all. And of course, then I'm thinking of him as active. Natura naturans literally translates as nature naturing. There's that activity. Natura naturata is the effects of God, right? The universe that God has created. As he says, all the modes of God's attributes, insofar as they are considered as things which are in God and can neither be conceived nor be conceived without God. This is passive. Again, literal translation. Nature natured, right? Passive. Now there is a question here. Are both natura naturans and natura naturata to be conceived as being identical to God? Scholars argue about this. I'm inclined to think that we are to think of them both as God. Clearly, we're to think of natura naturans as God, right? That is, God as active cause of the universe. But I'm inclined to think that we are also supposed to think of natura naturata as the effects, as also being God. So when we get to the appendix to part 1, he sums us up. He says, I've now explained the nature and properties of God, that he necessarily exists, that he is one alone, that he is and acts solely from the necessity of his own nature, that he is the free cause of all things, and how so? That all things are in God and are so dependent on him that they can neither be nor be conceived without him, and lastly, that all things have been predetermined by God, not from his free will or absolute pleasure, but from the absolute nature of God, his infinite power. But much of the appendix is devoted to how we misunderstand the nature of God and how we misunderstand the nature of the universe. So he says, all the prejudices which I intend to mention here turn on this one point, the widespread belief among men that all things in nature are like themselves and acting with an end in view. He pulls 2 points out here. The first, that there are no final ends or causes. There's nothing that the universe or things in the universe are aiming for or striving for. Spinoza's universe is completely and totally mechanical. Again, right? Effect follows cause in the way in which a conclusion follows deductively from its premises. No ends, no goals, no purposes here. Right? And secondly, Spinoza points out that it's a serious mistake to anthropomorphize God. Both of these mistakes, come back to that in a second, but both of these mistakes arise from out of our ignorance of causes. So when we say that something is contingent, when we say that it depends, that it could have happened in some other way, when I say that my getting the next lecture up is contingent upon my camera working, right? Depends upon my camera working. All I really am expressing, according to Spinoza, is my ignorance of the causal chain that will lead to my camera's either working or it's not working. It will either work or not work of necessity. That's already determined in the causal sequence at this point in time. But of course, I'm ignorant of that causal sequence. So when I express contingency, when we as human beings express contingency, precisely what we are expressing is our ignorance of causes. So he says, it will suffice at this point if I take as my basis what must be universally admitted, that all men are born ignorant of the causes of things, that they all have a desire to seek their own advantage, a desire of which they are conscious. Everyone aims for their own advantage. Spinoza takes that reasonably, right, to be a self-evident truth. From this it follows, firstly, that men believe that they are free, precisely because they are conscious of their volitions and desires. Yet, concerning the causes that have determined them to desire and will, they do not think, not even dream about, because they are ignorant of them. I believe I freely choose this and that and the other, but this is also just an expression of my ignorance of the causal sequence that leads me to have the desires and the wills that I do in fact have. Everything is causally determined. Secondly, he says, men act always with an end in view, to wit, the advantage that they seek. I always seek to pursue my advantage. There's an end. Hence it happens that they are always looking for the final causes of things done and are satisfied when they find them, having, of course, no reason for further doubt. But Spinoza has given us reason for further doubt, that in fact there are no final causes in us or in nature. So what does all this imply about the nature of God? Going back to that question about anthropomorphizing God, does it make sense to pray to this God? Does this God perform miracles? Does he have a plan? So all of these sort of traditional theistic attributions to God Do they make sense to imply about the nature of Spinoza's God? Is Spinoza a pantheist? Right? So a pantheist is someone who believes that God is everything, that God is all, right? That everything is God. Is Spinoza really a pantheist? Indeed, is he a theist at all in any traditional sense of the term? And that, of course, brings us back to what has been the theme of this lecture. Is he a hideous atheist? Or is he a God-intoxicated man? The next worksheet asks you to reflect on these and try to answer these questions. These will be, your reflections on these will, to some extent, be a matter of your opinion, your reading of Spinoza. There is much scholarly dispute about these questions. So that's all we've got for today. A little bit longer again than I would have liked, but it's hard to keep the stuff short. The next, we're going to move to Spinoza's conception of the human being, of us, in part 2 of the Ethics. And that I will put up on Wednesday. Take good care. Stay safe. Enjoy.